There are a lot of different ways to do terraces, and this is a small scale terrace that's done all with hand tools and that includes retaining walls. So retaining walls can be really great when you're doing terraces, because when you're terracing, what you are interested in is the amount of flat area that you are able to grow food in. And so in this small scale terrace, you're looking at this space. And usually this area here becomes the path, and this becomes the food growing area. And this is the path because it's the most compacted ground, and also because if you walk out here, you're putting pressure on this retaining wall. And so ideally, when you're building terraces, your wall would be totally vertical, because if you don't have a retaining wall, then you're taking up some of that horizontal space with your wall. And that's because if you don't use some sort of retaining wall, you can't have this should actually be flat. You can't have this bank be totally vertical, because it will cause erosion. And so, yeah, so you don't, I mean, a 45-degree angle is pretty ideal. I pushed that a little bit with these big terraces. They're probably a little bit more like 50 or 55 degrees. But whatever the case is, this is an option that maximizes the amount of flat area that you have. Now, the thing with this is when you go into large scale terraces, these retaining walls become a lot of work and a lot of money. And like when I lived in Spain, they had retaining walls for these terraces, and they were stone walls, and they were actually built like this, like into the hillside. And I worked on repairing one of these retaining walls, and it was an epic chore. Like this is a huge amount of work to create a large scale terrace with a retaining wall. With these small scale terraces, what my neighbor here has done is use charred pine. And so that'll last, I don't know. I mean, regular pine would probably last like 2 years. Locust tends to last like 5 years, maybe 10 years. And this charred pine, we will see, but I imagine that it will probably last like 5 to 8 years, something like that. And so with these small scale terraces, it's relatively easy to get material for those retaining walls, and it just makes a lot of sense to do retaining walls for these small scale gardens. And that's because you just want to maximize space, and you're doing it all by hand anyway. But for these large scale gardens, which we are doing, and these large scale terraces, then what we are doing, making a wooden retaining wall for these large scale terraces just would be very expensive, and then you'd have to replace it, and it would just be kind of silly. So what we're doing instead is we are using the ground itself as a retaining wall, and we are creating a bank. And so this bank does take up some of our horizontal space, but we are still really maximizing the amount of horizontal space that we had compared to, and usable space that we had compared with the hillside that we began with. And these banks can be planted with stuff. Now, I'm not going to be planting a whole lot on these banks because the amount of effort to maintain the plantings on the bank is a lot. Like, I don't want to be there with a weed whacker or with a scythe, like every 2 weeks, mowing around fruit trees that I've planted on the banks. If I had very, very, very little land, then yes, I would go ahead and do that. But as it is, I'm not going to be planting a bunch of stuff that needs a lot of tending on the banks. I am going to be planting some hazelnut trees at the very bottom of the bank, so that the way that these terraces are designed is they actually slope back slightly, so that when water falls on the terraces, it flows, if it's going to flow anywhere and doesn't get absorbed by the land, it's going to flow back this way. And that's really good for water retention. And that is awesome for recharging your springs and for just like making everything grow better. So water's going to flow this way. And so the hazelnut that I'm planting near the bottom of the bank, it has relatively deep roots. And so it can access this water that it's getting from the slope back of the bank. And so that is going to be awesome. And it's going to be relatively easy to maintain because it's right next to this path that's at the base of this terrace, or the inner part of this terrace. And so it'll be really easy for me to maintain those hazelnuts there. If I had the hazelnuts, on the other hand, planted halfway up this terrace, then their roots would not be able to access the water that is coming down here. And I would have to walk on this very steep bank, which is not what I want. This very steep bank. So I don't want to walk on the very steep bank. And so I'm going to, and being maintaining those. Basically, they just wouldn't get maintained and they would get taken over by weeds. And then what's the point of planting them? So instead, I'm going to plant them just at the base. And other than that, these banks are going to be mostly nitrogen fixing shrubs. I'm probably going to plant some other trees that are just there for bank retention, that are short or that I will coppice. And then I've got amorpha, I've got wildflowers, I've got clovers, I've got all sorts of various things that will be maintained simply by mowing with a weed whacker about once a year. And so that's what I'm going to do on those banks. And then these flat areas are going to be used for growing all sorts of things. They're going to be used for growing probably wheat or rye. They're going to be used for planting potatoes. They're going to be used for sweet potatoes. They could be used for fruit production, for berry production. Probably I will use them more for storage crops, for squashes, and all the things that I mentioned earlier, potatoes, sweet potatoes, maybe even some grains. So we will see. And it's very exciting. And it just really increases my chances for food security for this piece of land, which has a good number of people living on it.